it was miserable, and the fighting was brutal. One hilltop to another hilltop. There's the terrain in Italy is always suits the defenders, because you've got mountain after mountain after mountain and river after river after river. Lots of Italian friends, and they always told me that Mussolini defeated the Mafia before the war, and then when the Allies arrived, they kicked out all the fascists and they put the Mafia back in charge.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Times Radio History Myth-Busting. I'm James Hanson. Every episode we choose a moment from history or an historical figure, and I sit down with one of our experts to talk through some of the things that people get wrong. We'll also cover one or two things you may not know. Today we're back looking at Italy, and specifically Naples, to ask just how did this city and the country rebuild after the Second World War. And joining me today for the first time on the channel is the author and historian Keith Lowe. Keith, welcome to Times Radio History.
Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Let's begin by talking about your brand new book. It's called Naples 1944 and the Making of Post-War Italy. It's out now. Just tell us a bit about the book before we get into your myths.
Okay, well, Naples was the first major city to be liberated on the whole of continental Europe. So it struck me that this was a good place to start. If you're looking at how the liberation took place and what happened next, then Naples is an excellent place to start, because what happened in Naples was also then going to be reproduced as the liberation progressed throughout Europe. So Naples is like the template of what will happen to the rest of Europe as it's liberated.
And do you think Naples has been overlooked when people reflect on the Second World War, and why do you think that is?
Oh, absolutely, it's been overlooked. It's because the Allies weren't really that involved in liberating it. I mean, the battle that took place beforehand was the Battle of Salerno, the landings onto Italy, and while that was taking place, the people of Naples rose up themselves to fight off the Germans. And so, the Germans were removed from Naples before the Allies arrived. So, we don't remember it so much in this country because we didn't have a dog in the game. And the next battle which happens is Cassino, which is north of Naples. So we sort of seem to spring from Salerno and then up to Cassino. But we don't talk about the city which is at the center of it all, which is Naples.
And what is great about this book that you've written is it is the first major history of wartime Naples to appear in the English language. So, presumably as a result, because there hasn't been enough history of it, there must be loads of myths around wartime Naples.
Well, and Naples is a city which is built on myth, and so the myths have been going on for 3,000 years, and we've added to them in the last century or so. So there's lots of ideas that people have about Naples which are not quite correct. They might be based in truth, but you look at the details, you find out that actually it's much more complicated than we assumed it was.
OK, let's get into your myths. And the first one you've chosen for us, Keith, is actually around the weather. This is the myth of sunny Italy. Was that true? Was the weather that nice?
Well, we've all got a myth about sunny Italy. Even today, it's where we go on our summer holidays. So we imagine it's always sunny. But, of course, between sort of October and April, there's plenty of rain in Italy. And well, in 1943, 1944, this was particularly the case. It was, downpour all the time. The battlefields that we imagine in Italy, like I said, you tend to spring from Salerno to Cassino. Salerno took place in September. So we've got lots of photos of, the sun shining on a sparkling sea. And then again, the following May, when we're in, winning the Battle of Cassino, there are lots of photos of blue skies and so on. But the period in between there, when the Allies are fighting their way up towards Cassino, the battlefields look more like the Somme in 1916 than they do how we imagine them. There's mud everywhere, shell holes filled with water. All the rivers, there are lots of rivers they've got to cross. They're all in flood. So, this small river that would normally be, 10 meters wide or something is now 100 meters wide. So crossing it is really difficult. And, there were lots of complaints at the time by these poor frontline soldiers to to their forces newspapers about how awful it was. A lot of the British troops, for example, they're still wearing the same gear that they were wearing in the desert in North Africa. They're not prepared for this kind of warfare. So there's this wonderful. I've got it here actually. There's a wonderful column written in the Stars and Stripes, which is the U.S. Forces newspaper. It's called the column's called "Yank About Italy," and this is what he writes in November '43. He writes, "It's wrong to assume that it rains all the time in Italy, because sometimes it snows. Sometimes it rains and snows. Italy's probably the only country where this phenomenon occurs every third day. One day it rains, one day it snows, and the third day there's a double header." So there you go. That skewers the myth of a sunny Italy.
Yeah.
They thought it was permanent rain.
So I suppose that raises the question, well, then where does this myth come from? I mean, there were, songs at the time of, the D-Day Dodgers, and there was this sense that if you were fighting in Italy in 43 and 44, as opposed to, for example, the Allied invasion of France, you were somehow in a kind of easier theatre of war. Is that fair? Is that where this comes from?
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea that Italy is a place you go on your holidays. I mean, even at the time, they had this idea that Naples was going to be the city that it always had been on the grand tour. There'd be lots of lovely tourist sites to go to, lovely food, beautiful women, music everywhere. We've got a holiday idea about Naples.
And did any of that happen for the Allied troops? Did they experience any of that side of Naples?
Well, they did later. I mean, the Allies very much tried to make this dream come true. By setting up sort of holiday camps and running day trips to Pompeii and to Capri for soldiers on leave. But actually, when they first arrived in the city has been comprehensively destroyed. It's terrible, the destruction. It was bombed 100 times by the Allies. And then the Germans blew it all up before they left as well. So, it's a city in ruins. It's not really set up for tourists anymore, despite what the Allies wished for.
And I suppose the crucial thing in how Naples and the Italian campaign was perceived by troops in other theatres is the comparison thing. Because yes, the conditions are very difficult, but if you were an American at Guadalcanal, where the weather was so oppressively hot, it was incredibly difficult. You probably don't have that much sympathy. Similarly, if you were a Russian fighting in Stalingrad, you clearly are not going to have much sympathy because it's bitingly cold and you're fighting through these really horrendous Soviet winters. And so I suppose it's the comparison where Italy doesn't seem so bad.
Yeah, of course. I mean, would you rather be in the frozen steppes outside Stalingrad or on the Italian front? I mean, sure. Of course, you'd prefer to be in Italy, but that doesn't mean it was a picnic. It was miserable, and the fighting was brutal. One hilltop to another hilltop. There's the terrain in Italy is always suits the defenders, because you've got mountain after mountain after mountain and river after river after river, and crossing these things is really difficult. So yeah, the war was pretty brutal there too.
Okay, well, there we go. That's myth number one, the myth about sunny Italy, done and dusted. Let's move on to your second myth now, Keith, and this looks at post-liberation and then after the war. How quickly did life return to normal for the citizens of Naples and also for Italy more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, we do have this idea, don't we, that the war comes to an end and life goes back to normal. Well, obviously that's not going to be the case when you have a place which is so destroyed. When the Allies first rolled into Naples in October 1943, there were 20,000 people living in caves in Naples, caves and tunnels. They had nowhere else to live because their houses had all been blown up. And you'd imagine that this situation would alleviate itself pretty quickly. The war's moved on, you can start rebuilding, but there is no rebuilding. There's no materials to do anything with. So a couple of years later, when the UN is in there after 1945, there are still thousands of people living in caves and tunnels in Naples. They've basically been put back to the Stone Age. That's just Naples. The same thing happens as you go up through the destroyed communities and the battlefields on the way up through Italy. And the further you get into Europe, once you get into Germany, for example, everything's been destroyed. You simply can't go back to some kind of normality because people are living in ruins and they're starving and there's no way of getting food. Yeah.
And how much of that is also down to the behaviour of the Allies? I mean, was there mismanagement from the Allies that contributed to that?
Well, unfortunately, yeah. I mean, a lot of it is created by the war. But, then the Allies are in charge of things after the war has moved on. And they could have done things to alleviate things, which they didn't, partly because, their mind's elsewhere. They're thinking about fighting a war rather than trying to reproduce a better life for the civilians. And as a consequence, starvation gets really out of control. They're not shipping in the food that they should be. And there are plenty of people at the time who are clamoring for this, but they're just not being listened to. They want to rebuild certain things. Like, I'll give you an example in Naples. Naples is surrounded by some of the most beautiful farmland in the world. It's very rich soil, fed by Vesuvius, volcanic soil. So there's lots of food there, but you can't get the food into the city because all the transport's been destroyed. Also, you can't preserve it because Naples is also surrounded by canning factories, but all these have been blown up by the Germans before they left. Now, what the Allies could have done was spend a little bit of their resources on rebuilding the canning factories and putting in some transport, and then Naples would be able to feed itself. But rather than do that, they ship in all the food that they need for a year after, more than a year, 18 months. They're still shipping in all the food rather than allowing the Neapolitans to produce their own food. And that takes up shipping space. And it's sort of disaster all round. It's just mismanagement because they've taken their eye off the ball because they're focused on other things. They're focused on the war rather than on rebuilding the logistical systems.
That's really interesting. So just to be clear, you do think the Allies are partly to blame for the situation in post-war Italy?
Yeah, I think it's understandable, but they are partly to blame. And it's not just me saying that. It's the Allied military government officers of the time. They knew that they were not doing things properly. They were begging for more resources, and it just wasn't forthcoming.
And it's interesting because you say in the book that Naples became a playground for foreign troops. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's like I alluded to earlier. They want to make it into a place for soldiers to come on leave. So they, while all these people are living in caves, rather than sort of making better living standards for the local people, they are building holiday camps for soldiers to come there on leave. So they requisition all of the biggest buildings, all of the schools are taken up to house troops. So there is no school kids going to school anymore because they've got nowhere to go. They requisitioned the royal palace, the castles, all of the big main buildings in the centre of town, which again could have been used as housing. And there are reasons for this. Men who are fighting need to have somewhere to come on leave, and they need to be able to blow off steam, relax a little bit. But if you're Neapolitan and you see soldiers being given day trips to Capri where your family's starving, it's easy to see where resentments are going to grow. And resentments did indeed grow. Over that year, the people of Naples went from being really enthusiastic about the Allies arriving and liberating them and began to actually really resent them.
And so when we talk about some of the post-war planning to rebuild Italy, but also Germany, whatever, obviously people think of stuff like the Marshall Plan. What should have happened to make sure Italy could get back onto a strong footing as quickly as possible?
Oh, well, the Marshall Plan was brilliant. Everybody agrees that the Marshall Plan was a great success, a brilliant idea. But that was in 1948. In 1944, an economic commission went to Naples to say, look, this is the first city that's been liberated. It's really important we get this right and that we learn the lessons of it and apply it to the rest of Europe as we liberate that. And they were arguing for a kind of mini Marshall Plan for Naples in 1944. But nobody listened to them. It took them years and years and years, and only when the sort of communist threat from the East became the new threat after World War II did they finally get round to doing this. So, yes, great that the Marshall Plan happened, but it could have been done earlier. The resources were there, but they just weren't used in the right way.
And also, it's worth mentioning, I mean, you touch on this in the book. Amidst all of this, Naples has been liberated in 1944. The last thing the city needs, Vesuvius erupts.
Yeah, yes. Poor people of Naples can't catch a break. The Allies arrive. There's widespread famine. People are starving. There's a water crisis because the Germans have blown up all the water mains and all the sewers, so there's no clean water anywhere. Then the typhus epidemic breaks out across the city. They have to shut down the whole city, try and, a bit like when coronavirus happened here, they did the same thing, shut down the city. And then just when they're getting back on their feet again, Vesuvius erupts. So really, they couldn't catch a break.
No, absolutely. Let's move on to myth number 3 now. And this is something very specific and quite shocking, really. Tell us about the myth of the Naples Aquarium.
Ah, the Naples Aquarium. Well, I think there are sort of two types of myth, really. There's the myths that are based in reality, and that we just sort of we make a stereotype out of it, and rather than seeing all the nuance. And then there are those myths that are just plainly untrue, and this is one of them. The myth goes that the people of Naples were so starving in 1944 that they raided all the fish from the aquarium and ate them. And it even goes further and says that General Mark Clark was welcomed into the city by they put on a banquet for him where they served up the manatee from the aquarium and served it up to him with a sort of herb and garlic sauce. And it turns out that none of this is true. None of this happened.
So, I mean, I've got to ask, where does it come from then?
Where does it come from, indeed? Well, there's a rather famous memoir called Naples 44 by Norman Lewis. And he tells this story. I mean, I don't want to sort of blame Norman Lewis for this, because it is just a memoir, and people, memories are not, it's not history. It's someone's memory of what happened. And somewhere along the line, he's picked up a story which first appeared in a novel by Curzio Malaparte. It's called The Skin. And he tells the story of the Naples Aquarium being stripped of all its fish because people are starving, and the manatee being served up to Mark Clark. So somewhere along the line, this fiction has sort of found its way into Norman Lewis's memory, and he puts it in his brilliant, by the way, brilliant wartime memoir. And then historians come along and they see this and they take it and they start quoting it's true. In fact, I myself made this mistake in my earlier book, Savage Continent. I quoted this as something which actually happened. But all you need to do is what I've done for my most latest book and check the newspapers. The local newspapers show that all the way through the war, the Naples Aquarium was open. They charged 20 lira to American soldiers to come and look at the fish, which were all still there, all still alive. Don't know whether there was a manatee in there or not, but absolutely no basis for this idea at all. It just comes from a novel.
But I suppose where, and as you say, Keith, there's no basis to it at all, but where you can kind of see how it got promoted is that there was a kernel of truth in the fact that clearly the people of Naples were very hungry. Starvation was a very real risk. And so you can see how the kind of situation was ripe for this myth to be spread.
Yes, absolutely. And it is a very evocative way of wrapping up in one little story a lot of misery. It's sort of like shorthand, I suppose. There is a kernel of truth in it, of course. People were starving. But that's the difference between memory and history. As a historian, I've got to look at actually what did happen, which was bad enough. There was plenty of real stories of starvation. But this particular story didn't happen.
Yeah, and did people go to quite extreme lengths, obviously not raiding the aquarium, did they go to quite extreme lengths to feed themselves?
Oh, of course. Of course. I mean, one of the problems is, again, partly down to Allied mismanagement, is that inflation went through the roof. You've got all these soldiers coming there on leave, spending lots of money and buying up all the food to have like fancy meals in restaurants and so on. And the price of food gets so high that ordinary people can't afford it. So they end up selling whatever they have. They sell their furniture, they sell their clothes, they sell their jewelry, of course. And when they run out of things to sell, well, there's only one thing left, isn't there? And so that there's huge amounts of prostitution throughout the city. As women who have to feed the kids somehow will sleep with Allied soldiers and be paid in food. Often, a can of bully beef is all you need to sleep with a Neapolitan woman in 1944. It's terrible.
Well, let's move on now to myth number 4, and this is a big and a potentially very controversial one. This is around the Italian resistance. How significant was the Italian resistance, Keith?
Okay, the Italian resistance was significant. I suppose the mythical element of this is that much like lots of nations in occupied Europe, after the war, everybody wants to believe they were all in the resistance, and of course they weren't. There was actually Naples was the first place where resistance took place. Before the Allies arrived, as I said, the people of Naples rose up against the Germans and kicked them out. And this was a fantastic. It was called the 4 Days of Naples. It was a fantastic event. But the myth goes that the entire city did this. Everybody rose up as one. That's what Neapolitans like to believe about themselves. And people from outside have no reason to disbelieve them. But actually, if you look at what really did happen, there were plenty of Neapolitans who didn't rise up. They went up onto the roofs and as snipers and started shooting down at the resistors in the barricades below. So there was a sort of mini civil war going on between those Neapolitans who wanted to welcome the Allies and those Neapolitans who wanted to stay with the Germans. So that's just Naples. Then you can expand that to the whole of Italy. We remember the Italians changing sides, swapping sides. They were with the Germans, they're now with the Allies. That only happened for half of Italy. The other half of Italy stayed with the Germans. They have the Republic of Salo under Mussolini all the way through till 1945. So you have this civil war going on between Italians and Italians at the same time as there is also a war of national liberation going on to kick the Germans out.
So this myth around the Italian resistance and, if you use Naples as a microcosm, the Neapolitan people all as one rising up over those 4 days to take the fight to the Germans. I mean, does that just come about because, frankly, after the event, after World War II, it makes you look good?
Of course, everybody wants to be on the right side, don't they? And there's also a myth that, there's loads of myths about this. There's also a myth that it was the communists who were running all this, and the communists were in charge, and all the partisans were all communist. So nowadays there's a little pushback against the original myth that everybody was in it together, saying that it was run by the communists, so maybe the fascists weren't so bad to be fighting against them. That's also a myth, because there were 6 major political parties: the communists, the socialists, the Christian Democrats were also fighting, the Action Party. There were lots of people who weren't communists who were part of the this resistance. So everybody wants to be on the right side of history somewhere along the line, and they'll change the facts to suit their political opinions.
And how much was there a big geographical divide? I mean, if the resistance was maybe a bit stronger in Naples, was there a massive divide between the south of Italy and the north of Italy?
Well, there were absolutely. There's always been a divide anyway between the south and the north. But during the war, there's a front line. On the north of it, it's being run by fascists, and the south of it, it's being run by the Allies and the Italian king. So the memory around this is that you've got the resistance in the north of Italy. They've got a year and a half of fighting against the Germans, so they have time to build their myth, and they also have time to create sort of a coherent sort of army structure. So they're very organized by the end of the war in the north. In the south, everything happens much more quickly. Naples is taken after just 3 or 4 weeks of fighting. So the resistance there doesn't have time to organize itself into a proper organization. It's just spontaneous. It's just ordinary people grabbing a gun and talking to their neighbors and shoving up a barricade. So there's this divide about how the resistance sees itself in the north as this organized structure, and they see the resistance in the south as just a rabble who just it's just a sort of uprising. It's not a properly organized resistance.
Okay, there we go. 4 myths down, 1 to go. Let's move on to the final myth you've chosen for us, Keith. I'm looking forward to this one. No list about Italy and Naples and myths would be complete without mentioning the Mafia. Just how big a role did the Mafia have?
Right. Well, this is a myth I remember from my childhood. I used to spend every summer in Italy when I was a kid, and we had lots of Italian friends, and they always told me that Mussolini defeated the Mafia before the war, and then when the Allies arrived, they kicked out all the fascists and they put the Mafia back in charge. It's a sort of lovely way of excusing the fact that the Mafia were so strong in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Not quite true, unfortunately. I've discovered there were instances where. Let's look at Mussolini destroying the Mafia. That didn't happen. The Mafia was comprehensively destroyed before Mussolini got into power. It was done by the liberals even before the First World War. So they completely overtook the Mafia, started imprisoning hundreds of people, and those who were left fled to America. So the reason why there was such a heavy Mafia presence in the USA is because they all fled Sicily and Italy in the 1910s and at the beginning of the century. So Mussolini didn't defeat the Mafia. It was already done. He put out lots of propaganda to say that he had, I'm the big man, I defeated the Mafia. But actually, all he really did was institute a new kind of quasi-Mafia system with the fascists, who were just as corrupt and extorted stuff from people just like the Mafia used to. So then you have the Allies coming in. Did they reinstate the Mafia? Well, in a couple of towns, yes, they did. In Sicily, the Italian Mafia, who are now American citizens, come back with the Americans when they invade Sicily and Naples. And so 1 or 2 of them end up as mayors of local towns because the Americans installed them there.
And they did install them. That didn't happen by accident. They were actively installed by the Americans, weren't they?
Yeah, they actively installed. They were, they sort of saw them as they might be, have a dodgy past, but they speak Italian, they know the system, and they're on our side. So we'll put them in charge.
They're wrong-uns, but there are wrong-uns.
Sorry?
They're wrong-uns, but there are wrong-uns.
Exactly. They're wrong-uns, but there are wrong-uns. When it comes to southern Italy, this didn't really happen. The Allies were very careful about who they put in charge. They would remove a fascist mayor, but then they'd very carefully vet who was going to be put in their place. They wanted someone who wasn't corrupt and who wasn't fascist. The problem came about when you hand territory back over to the Italian government. They then took out all the mayors that the Allies had installed and put back in the old fascists, because the Italian government is filled with fascists. The Italian Prime Minister Pietro Badoglio had served all the way through with Mussolini. He was a war criminal, and yet we left him in charge. The king, he installed Mussolini in the first place and kept him in power all the way through the 20s and 30s. Did we remove the king? No, we left him in charge. So the Italian government is full of all these sort of corrupt people, and as soon as the Allies move on, they reinstall all their corrupt people. That's what actually happened. It wasn't the Allies installing corruption.
And so this myth that somehow, they had completely disappeared because of Mussolini, is that just apologists for Mussolini trying to promulgate that myth because it makes him look like a competent leader?
Yes, and they're taking 1920s and 30s propaganda at face value. Mussolini was very good at blowing his own trumpet. He owned all the press. So yeah, there were all these stories about him, destroying the mafia and aren't I brilliant? I'm reproducing proper law and order. And no, he's not. Actually, a lot of mafia people who were still there ended up, they knew which side their bread would be buttered. They ended up joining the fascists and being part of them. So, you know, Achille Lauro, for example, he was a very dodgy, he wasn't mafia, but he was a very dodgy person who ended up making a fortune after the war. He was a fascist through and through. Reinstalled as the mayor of Naples after World War II, carried on all the way through the 50s. Out and out fascist.
There we go, 5 myths comprehensively busted. Thank you so much for doing that, Keith. Before we go, we always like to end the show by hearing one true fact that maybe a lot of people don't know, but we ought to know. What have you chosen for us?
Well, I thought, do you know how Naples got its name?
I have no idea how Naples got its name.
Well, Naples was not originally called Naples. This is one of the oldest cities in the whole of Italy. It was founded about 3,000 years ago, not by the ancient Romans, but by the ancient Greeks. So it was originally called Parthenope, which is, you know, we've been talking about myths here. So Parthenope is part of the ancient Greek myths. She's a siren, one of the sirens, you know, these mythical beasts that lure sailors onto the rocks with their beautiful songs. And the story goes that she tried to lure Odysseus onto the rocks by singing, but Odysseus had been forewarned and he put wax in the ears of all his sailors, so they didn't get, seduced. And Parthenope was so distraught by this that she threw herself into the sea and she drowned. And when her body washed up on the shore near present-day Naples, the Greek traders who were living there buried her body on the hill, and they named their city Parthenope in her honor. Naples only came like a couple of centuries later when they built a new suburb of the city, and they called it Neapolis, the new city. So Naples gets its name from being a new city 2,500 years ago. It's not very new now, but it's still called the new city.
Keith, that is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us today. Should mention Keith's brilliant new book is called Naples 1944 and the Making of Post-War Italy. Keith, thank you so much. That is all we've got time for today, but we will be back busting more historical myths very soon. And if there's anything you want to see us deconstruct, let us know in the comments below. Remember to like this video, share and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History. Goodbye.